It was a game with the mythos of the Star Wars universe, led by industry RPG veteran BioWare and backed by EA's funding. An MMO with likely the largest budget we have ever seen to date, and expectations for the game to revolutionize the very market. Following critically acclaimed RPGs Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, Star Wars The Old Republic was to be much more than just a sequel, more than just a trilogy title. SWTOR, as it is often called, was praised to be as the KOTOR 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 to the KOTOR universe. An MMO that was supposed to take the torch from the already dying Star Wars MMO at the time, Star Wars Galaxies. But what went wrong? Why did SWTOR, a title backed by the immensely popular Old Republic universe, not quite satisfy its hefty expectations? On this episode of Death of a Game, we will tackle the behemoth of a story behind SWTOR and why it failed as a game and, most importantly, as an MMO. SWTOR started from the idea that BioWare, in 2006, wanted to do an MMORPG. BioWare, located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, by 2008 had already launched 13 titles since its beginning as a studio in 1995. Just about all of those titles were RPGs, and one of the very first of them was none other than the now legendary RPG Baldur's Gate. BioWare also did Neverwinter Nights, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Jade Empire, and Mass Effect, all by 2008. Needless to say, BioWare, despite being known as a small studio, had released some absolute titans in the RPG space. People were excited when they announced a studio based in Austin, Texas in 2006 titled BioWare Austin. It would be solely focusing on an untitled MMORPG. Very little was known about this mysterious MMORPG early on, except that they would be using the Hero engine. This was really the first time BioWare had elected to go to someone else to utilize an engine. They had primarily created their own, sans the Unreal Engine present in Mass Effect. To backtrack slightly, in 2005, BioWare and Pandemic Studios, who are the studio behind the original Star Wars Battlefront games, entered a partnership with a private equity fund, Elevation Partners. What was most interesting about this was two things really. First, this was a departure from the typical developer-publisher relationship that BioWare was quite used to. BioWare and Pandemic were now effectively owned by this said investor. The most interesting thing to note, however, was that John Riccitiello was a board member at Elevation Partners. This name might seem random or not important to you, or perhaps you just don't understand my pronunciation, but Riccitiello was a former COO, a Chief Operating Officer at Electronic Arts, something he was brutally efficient at, seeing EA rise from its $673 million revenue in 1997 to its $3 billion revenue in 2004. This all comes full circle in 2007 when John Riccitiello rejoins Electronic Arts, this time as the CEO. Likely not much of a surprise to those who connected the dots back then or are just connecting the dots now. Upon returning on October 11, 2007, EA purchased VG Holding Corp., the organization that Elevation Partners, BioWare, and Pandemic had newly formed, effectively buying both Pandemic Studios, and most importantly for this video, BioWare. Yep, that meant that BioWare became EA BioWare and received a new round of funding. Gordon Walton, a key figure behind SWG and Sims projects, would lead the BioWare Austin studio as they prepared their next unknown project. But the project wasn't completely mysterious. Rumors circulated that the MMORPG in development was none other than a KOTOR 3 of sorts, or some sort of MMO set in the Old Republic universe. These rumors started to seem a bit more real as BioWare and LucasArts entered a partnership in October 2007. Something you would expect from a company just about to launch a Star Wars project. Still, things were kept quite effectively in the dark. It wasn't until a year later at E3 2008 that we saw the CEO of EA, John Riccitiello, the mastermind behind EA buying BioWare, vaguely mention an announcement coming later that year that promised more details on the project. The big reveal came October of 2008. Screenshots, game details, story details, and much more were revealed. The project, to no one's surprise at that point, was none other than Star Wars The Old Republic, an MMO based in the Old Republic universe. There would be a number of classes, you would have origin stories for each, and they would all have their own unique feels and backgrounds. James Olin, a lead developer behind Neverwinter Nights, Baldur's Gate 2, and most relevant for this video, Star Wars KOTOR 1. Olin would be the lead developer on the project. The lead writer on the project was none other than Drew Karpyshyn, the writer behind KOTOR 1, Neverwinter Nights, Mass Effect, and Baldur's Gate 2. It seemed that the project was in good hands. Details were scarce in regards to actual gameplay, though a bit trickled out in the video documentary series BioWare did on YouTube, December of 2008. It wasn't until August 2010, over a year and a half later, that full unedited gameplay was released for fans to view. This video was from a multiplayer demo at E3 2010. The video demonstrated the game as being tab target based and having a fairly typical looking combat system. But fans, including me begrudgingly, were still extremely excited for the project. We were after all expecting a third KOTOR, and the combat here didn't seem much worse than a KOTOR project would have been. Over the course of that year into the next, which was 2011 at this point, class archetypes were slowly being let out. The classes for the game were divided as follows. For the Republic side, you had the Trooper, Smuggler, Jedi Knight, and Jedi Counselor. The Sith side had the Bounty Hunters, Sith Warrior, Imperial Agent, and the Sith Inquisitor. These classes would be divided by advanced classes, which were specializations within each class. These advanced classes had two, now currently three, one of which is shared, different specializations within them as well. It seemed like a fairly normal talent system, with the perks of having an extra specialization. BioWare utilized its YouTube channel to unveil more and more information before the launch of the game. They had a heavy focus on story content, which as people began to figure out was the ultimate focus of SWTOR. It was to be a full voice-acted story-based MMO. It would have raids, PvE, PvP in the form of a PvP-focused planet and battleground, guilds and guild content, and the like. To explain some of the gameplay specifics for the game, PvP was divided by battlegrounds called war zones in SWTOR. PvP servers allowed PvP on dual faction planets, which were planets that allowed both factions to be on. And then Ilum, which was to be the in-game PvP planet. PvE was divided by single-player missions, group missions, operations, and flashpoints. Operations were in-game raids, and flashpoints were group story missions. Space combat was an on-rails shooter that was at the time of launch only PvE. On-rails essentially meant that it was much like Star Fox, where you are led along a path and shoot and fight targets as they enter your view. This was a massive downgrade compared to SWG or Star Wars Galaxy's space combat, a serious point of contention for some. Closed beta had started late 2010 and had carried into much of 2011. Open beta came as late as November, a mere month before the supposed launch of the game. The floodgates were finally opened, but this came awfully late for some. In a move likely meant to aid BioWare in their upcoming launch, and also to assist a struggling company in Mythic, EA combined both companies in an MMORPG division led by BioWare co-founder Ray Mizuka. This likely was the writing on the wall for Mythic, but at least BioWare was going to get some well-needed experience managing an MMO in Warhammer, which had launched the previous year. EA BioWare, well, BioWare Mythic as it was now dubbed, announced the launch of SWTOR on December 20th, 2011, roughly 5 to 6 years after it began development. The business model would be a typical sub-based model, mimicking the frankly saturated MMO market at the time. But BioWare and EA weren't worried about the competition. The rumored budget for the game was in the range of $100 to $200 million. EA and BioWare had invested substantially in the game. There was no failing. Failing was not an option.
Do or do not. There is no try.
They were not allowed to be mediocre. SWTOR needed to be a smash hit. It needed to be successful. The game, meeting its launch date, was in stores December 20th, 2011. The response was overwhelming. Servers were surely taxed and it looked like EA's investment in BioWare had paid off. As reported by EA's 2011 financials, SWTOR had sold over 2 million copies and had near 2 million active subscribers. EA for the year ended up earning an adjusted $344 million for a total net loss of $205 million, which isn't bad if you consider how much money they had just poured into the development and the launch of the Old Republic. The critics' opinions of the fledgling MMO were outlets like IGN giving the game a 90 out of 100, stating that a standout, wonderfully crafted MMO, the story elements deliver on every front, the vocal performances are excellent, and some genuinely clever innovations have been applied to PvP combat. MMORPG.com gave SWTOR an 87 out of 100, stating that every couple of years we get an MMO whose level of hype and expectations are greater than the game could ever aspire to be, and the same remains true for Star Wars: The Old Republic. Even so, the game is simply exceptional. Players of the game, on the other hand, weren't so generous. Based on the 2,675 ratings present on Metacritic, they gave the game a 5.9 out of 10. Most of them saying that the combat was clunky, due to an ability delay that was still present since beta. They also critiqued the lack of in-game content, the performance of the game, as well as the WoW-like art style and graphics present in the game. Frankly, there are such a plethora of issues, we will save that for later in the video as per usual. Needless to say, despite SWTOR selling well, the players weren't happy with the game. It felt like a single-player game with WoW graphics and a dated combat system. March 2012, sub numbers for SWTOR were supposed to be in the 1.7 million range, which was still respectable for an MMO, though roughly a few 100k less than was present at launch based on sold copies. Within one more month, however, that 1.7 million number dropped 400,000 down to 1.3 million. Servers, cleverly designed by BioWare, didn't list population numbers, instead they listed them as being 1 equals light, 2 equals standard, 3 equals heavy, and 4 equals very heavy, 5 finally being full. As the article on screen shows, light was about up to 500 players, standard about 1500, heavy to about 2250 to 2500, very heavy to up to about 3000, and full was anything greater than 3000. Surprisingly enough, the most popular server was a PvP server. This was despite SWTOR not having a particular focus on PvP. According to the statistics on screen, next to no servers in May 2012 were very heavy or full, not necessarily saying that the game was hurting in population, but certainly not a good sign. At least by normal MMO metrics, in regards to SWTOR, I would say the numbers were still quite fair. Rumblings were heard in August 2012. It seemed that the execs at EA wanted BioWare to transition SWTOR to a free-to-play MMO. But BioWare was hesitant. Going free-to-play had a negative connotation. It was almost akin to admitting some level of failure. Coming as a shock to some though, as November 2012 came along, EA announced that SWTOR would be indeed going free-to-play. There's two reasons for this. SWTOR's sub numbers were obviously downtrending based on prior statistics, but the other reason, according to BioWare, was the reality of the marketplace today is that the subscription model is a barrier for consumers, according to BioWare. What came with the free-to-play change was a revamp of the business model as well as the armor, credits, and many more systems within the game. There would be a free-to-play player, a preferred player, which is merely someone who has spent money on the cartel market, the cash shop for SWTOR. This preferred player, as outlined on screen, got a few perks. Finally, you had the subscriber, who pays the monthly fee and reaps the most rewards. Cartel points, which could be obtained without paying money, but were rather difficult to obtain otherwise. The largest changes, as outlined by the article on screen, were that non-subscribers got a 25% XP penalty, a credit cap, and you also had to purchase a weekly pass for operations, flashpoints, and war zones. Subscribers got unlimited instant resurrections, whereas otherwise you got a limited amount and were forced to resurrect at a Medroid. Mail had some restrictions, as did the inventory space for the free-to-play player. These were all different ways that BioWare incentivized you to buy a sub, or to at least become a preferred player. We know that was probably more strong-arming, if anything. Not a lot of people were happy with such changes because they believed that, well, the game was really unplayable as a free-to-play player. But that, I mean, it technically isn't, and that's sort of how free-to-play games or MMOs get by. You don't technically have to spend money, right? But they sure damn make sure you better spend at least a little bit. Likely the most controversial, at least related to the current happenings in the market, was cartel packs. These were the way that you could unlock rare armor, although they were cosmetic from the point that you could have other kinds of armor without needing these due to armor not inherently having a value anymore. It was more something that you upgraded, but still, these were loot boxes, semantics or not. As mid-2013 came, EA president Frank Gibeau had some information to share concerning SWTOR's sub numbers and revenue since going free-to-play. Since it was induced in November, we've added more than 1.7 million new players on the free model to the service, he said, and the number of subscriptions has stabilized at just under 500,000. This really interesting thing that's happening inside our service right now is the monthly average revenue for the game has more than doubled since we introduced the free-to-play option. Once again, showing the market that free-to-play kind of was the way to go. As of May 2013, subs were at just under 500,000, a far cry from their initial 2 million number at launch. But that didn't necessarily mean SWTOR was floundering. As EA's president pointed out, they had doubled their monthly average revenue. It seemed like a free-to-play switch had been largely successful for the game, likely not coming as a surprise to some, well, at least to those who follow my channel and have seen this occur quite frequently. It's much easier to sell someone a product when they can already get a healthy dose of it. SWTOR coming into 2014 had one expansion already launched the previous year, Rise of the Hutt Cartel, and an expansion to come by the end of the year in Shadow of Revan. Rise of the Hutt Cartel added player housing in the form of galactic strongholds, while the Shadow of Revan expansion was easily the largest content injected into SWTOR yet. 2 new planets, a raised level cap, and an entire set of story missions and such dedicated to the story of Revan. This likely explains the good year 2014 was for SWTOR, well in regards to overall revenue. As sub numbers continue to fall, revenue didn't. It increased even. According to a Superdata report, which was essentially a media company given rights by different publishers and developers to release data given to them by those said people, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's the best bit of data that I can possibly get. Anyway, according to the report, SWTOR had earned 165 million in 2014, which in terms of overall revenue placed it at number 4 versus other MMOs. The only MMOs to beat it were Lineage, Terra, and of course WoW. Of this 165 million, 139 of it was due to free-to-play revenue, aka microtransactions. If we do some mental maths, 165 minus 139 meant that 24 of that 165 million was due to subscriber revenue. If we divide that by 12 and then $15 a month, we get a population of roughly 144,000 players to close out the year of 2014, rather the subscriber numbers. 13% of the initial subscriber numbers, but I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. Sure, a loss of subscribers is objectively bad no matter how you look at it, point blank, but as these financials prove, the game is still making money. Shadow of Revan naturally brought more intrigue to SWTOR. Revan was and is quite a popular character. I would argue that the expansion was decent, but only because of the changes that accompanied the story content. The actual Revan story content, well, I made a whole other video talking about Revan and his story, so go watch the Revan Decoded video for more of that. The biggest changes that came with Shadow of Revan were not obvious to some. Story content, at least more specifically group content, was now soloable. This was a crucial step in the design of SWTOR. It meant that BioWare in a way had committed to making SWTOR, well, an MMORPG. That's a lowercase MMO and an uppercase RPG. The game was less MMO and more RPG. Positive for some, surely, in the sense that they believed the game should have been that way to start, but negative to others as the game became frankly less and less of an MMO. The story was obviously a huge focus in the expansion, and the people still playing were likely accepting of such. But for people wanting a massive multiplayer online game, the one that was, well, initially promised, it might not have been the best move for BioWare.
A man can have anything if he is willing to sacrifice.
As 2014 came to a close, summer of 2015 saw the announcement of yet another expansion for SWTOR. The expansion, titled Knights of the Fallen Empire, featured a renewed focus on cinematic storyline, further pushing the game to more of an RPG-like experience versus an MMO experience. This meant more voice-acted quests, more planets, more companions fully voiced, a raised level cap, and finally a player choice system that surely would affect the way each individual played the game. EA BioWare brought out the big guns for this expansion, enlisting the help again from the motion graphics studio Blur. Blur helped create intrigue for the upcoming expansion, and once again created an award-winning trailer. The story that the Knights of the Fallen Empire presented was considered a step in the right direction for the remaining SWTOR fans, well, at least some of them, the ones that wanted the game to just embrace its RPG roots. However, despite all the new story content the game presented, it wasn't enough in some critics' eyes to deal with the dated and frankly easy combat, as well as the endgame the expansion introduced, which was essentially WoW's garrisons with copy-paste Flashpoint content. It's not like EA BioWare was tone-deaf in their poor combat in SWTOR. They gave people the ability to make a level 60 character to participate immediately in the story content. They certainly knew where their strengths were. What the expansion also brought, to much hate and grumblings amongst the remaining community, was RNG armor progression. As explained in the MMORPG article, the biggest gripe people had with the new progression system was that in many ways it was a regression in regards to how the Battlemaster PvP bags used to work, which were RNG based as well. Instead of the basic system of when you needed a piece of gear you'd roll on it, and when you didn't then you wouldn't roll on it. Now it would require everyone to rely on RNG to get the correct gear that they needed. You could consume duplicate pieces, sure, but this would still equal a net slower progression and a more RNG based progression system. It has proven difficult to track population numbers in 2015 to 2016, but according to stats released at the end of 2015 by SWTOR, there was still 1 million active quote-unquote players. This meant paid and free players combined, playing for any number of time, not entirely helpful in judging the popularity of the game, but based on our previous maths, we know that the subs were surely under 150k. SWTOR would have yet another expansion, launching a follow-up expansion to the previous Knights of the Fallen Empire, naming this one Knights of the Eternal Throne. This expansion, much like the previous, added more cinematic story content for the game, a PvP space map, a new flashpoint, a new operations, and an enhanced group finder. These were all positive changes, but it seemed like the lack of response for such was less to do with the changes and more to do with, well, the base game. The framework under all of it was not particularly enjoyable to many, and it seemed despite the immense effort put into the story and combat and gameplay, it was still just a bit disjointed. A Eurogamer article speculated that SWTOR was holding back the Knights of the Fallen Empire / Eternal Throne storyline. Most importantly, the last bit of the article made a rather bold claim. This is not the Knights of the Republic 3, nor was the Knights of the Fallen Empire KOTOR 3. Something built on SWTOR will never be. But these are sentiments that I echo, frankly, and sentiments I see echoed by other fans quite commonly. It wasn't a matter if SWTOR was worth playing. Many seem to believe it was at least enough to participate in the story content for a month or so, but prolonged play, commonly found in MMOs, that didn't seem to be what players of the game were interested in. This was backed up on November 8th, 2017, when SWTOR combined their existing 17 servers into a cluster of 5 servers, claiming such was to help use the new group finder mechanic, which I'm sure is partially true, but it's surely never a good thing to see an MMO combine 17 of its servers into 5 servers. But as of December 14th, 2017, SWTOR is still very much alive. So why did I decide to make a death of a game on SWTOR? I don't normally explain why I deem a game dead, at least not anymore, as the evidence that I outline quite clearly explains such, generally at least. SWTOR is a bit different though. To most it might seem like a mystery, and to SWTOR fanboys posting right now that the game isn't dead, let me elucidate. Remember, whenever I ask the question of if a game is dead or not, I am asking it from the perspective that takes into consideration the initial expectations, financial strength, and its impact on the market. It's not and never has been a question of literal death, but feel free to spam me with those comments. As for a bit of background on my SWTOR journey, I was in a pre-game guild for the game 3 years before it launched. I was invited to alpha test, my guild was then invited to a closed beta test, and finally we all did some open beta testing as well. Needless to say, before SWTOR even launched, I had basically been playing the game for about a year. I quit shortly after launch, seeing the writing on the wall much earlier than most due to my prior background with the game. If you guys don't know already, I was a massive SWG fan, and a Star Wars fan in general. I wanted so badly for SWTOR to work. Now that I got that out of the way, let's break down a couple key factors of why I consider SWTOR to be dead or dying. One thing that can't be disputed is the initial business model of the game was to be sub-based. When they went free to play, a key way to make money was still very much reliant on these subscription fees. This is why the game was set up in a way that it was upon the change to free to play, to incentivize people to pay to play. It's not that SWTOR was only relying on such to make money, their subscriber base if you will. They clearly proved this wasn't the case by being able to continue to make hundreds of millions a year after going free to play. Sure, sub numbers aren't the most important stat per se, at least not in a free-to-play MMO, but it's still a stat that I want you guys to pay close attention to. Subs are more than just money coming in, they are a guarantee that money is coming in, which in turn can guarantee more support for the said game. It's almost like if I have a small bike company and I ask people for pre-order money because I need to know how much product to create, well, that's very helpful. It allows me to know how much product I need to buy in order to manufacture the right amount of bikes or whatever else and then deliver on the sale. EA closely guards its financial information, especially for SWTOR, but we know that as of the beginning of 2015, based on financials release, we figured that the sub numbers for SWTOR were under 150,000 players. This is 300,000 less than the previous year and over 1.5 million less than the year before that. Clearly a drop in sub players. As of 2015 statistics, 1 million players were said to have still been playing the game, but it didn't specify how many average hour those people, well, they played. How many hours did they actually play? So the numbers aren't really that helpful. However, when you compare it to Elder Scrolls, who just this year boasted 8.5 million players playing, it's certainly not even close to the same population as its competition, and that 1 million players number is 2 years old at this point, and according to EA financials and server statistics and population, it's only decreased since then. BioWare's switch to single-player content versus the more MMORPG content to me is a clear sign that they aren't trying to be the big MMORPG anymore. They realize where their strength is, and are taking advantage of such. Yes, absolutely. But this also means that they are willing and purposely giving up a bigger share of the MMORPG market in favor of doing, well, more of a niche story product. Surely everyone recognizes this is a smart business move, and likely the move that the fans who still play the game probably support. But when you no longer are trying to be the massive multiplayer game that you promised to be, you by nature are shrinking your player base and therefore market share, which means money. I mean, it's in the name, massive multiplayer. These MMOs have millions of players. When you are actively not trying to be an MMO anymore, you are directly contributing to having a smaller player base. Just about the only way we have an actual look into the financial workings for SWTOR are going to EA's financial website and their information. EA is a publicly traded company and you can observe their financials. This naturally is difficult because they try to obscure as much details as we can possibly glean from such, at least as humanly possible. Still, we are able to glean a bit of information about the game's revenue and even population. I looked through the different financials presented by EA, but found the website SWTOR Economics to be way more helpful than any of the information that I can glean. Analyzing financials from as far back as 2012 leading up to 2016, we can track some patterns in the data. 2012 to 2013 financials, naturally we see SWTOR as a leading revenue generator for EA. 2014 to 2015 financials, we see that SWTOR starts to experience an acceleration in the decline of their revenue. Over the course of 24 months, this number is consistently accelerating. SWTOR's economics conclusion on these reports detailed about the decline in SWTOR's revenue for a period of 2.5 years. This, as SWTOR economics also highlights, is more of a severe issue due to EA having to pay some sort of licensing fee for Star Wars, and it certainly can't be cheap. Diving a bit deeper on more recent data, financials from 2016 show a clear downturn for the past year and change for SWTOR in both population and revenue. We find that the Fallen Empire expansion wasn't as positively received as the Shadow of Revan, or at least it didn't make them as much money according to the financials. Another thing outlined was that SWTOR was credited with being the largest reason in the decrease in subscription revenue for EA. Most troubling, and most relevant for me even doing this section, was SWTOR Economics' analysis at the end of the article. Over the past 6 to 12 months, as the article's written date, June 2016, stated, SWTOR by that point had been losing subs, players, total playtime, and revenue. Fast forward a year and a half with server merges and an obvious focus on smaller story content versus the MMO type content, it's really impossible to admit that SWTOR in the past 2 to almost 3 years is not on a steady decline. As the writer of the article also explains, to which I echo the sentiments, it's that clearly SWTOR had cut as much cost as possible, but there's only so much to cut when it comes to a large beast like SWTOR, a title that is expensive to maintain and to pay for a license for. Too long didn't read or watch, EA's financials show a clear downtrend in SWTOR's revenue and player base, as do server statistics on Tor status. Now that I have adequately explained why I think SWTOR is very much dying, let's get into reasons why I think it is. But first, it's always important to highlight the most positive features of a game or company before we get into the details as to why they might have met their demise in some way. When we explain the legacy of a title like SWTOR, we give everyone a better picture of why it is important it is dying or near death. So what did SWTOR do right? What are things the video game industry will remember the title most for? I have featured MMOs such as Age of Conan, City of Heroes, and Matrix Online, which all boasted some sort of focus on a main story of sort, but none can really come close to the levels that SWTOR went to with its multitude of story options. Every class had a unique story, and then you have story/group missions, and then story-based raids and operations. The entire focus of SWTOR in many ways was always its story. But besides the plethora of writing and story content, what SWTOR can boast which no other MMO to this date can, is that it was a fully voiced MMO. That's what really got fans of the KOTOR series so excited. The idea that they could see the KOTOR series carried on with fully voice acted characters and a plethora of story missions to partake in. Some storylines, such as my 2 personal favorites, the Imperial Agent and the Sith Warrior, could have vastly different playthroughs depending on how you made your decisions throughout the progression of the story. Both of these classes have stories that could be good enough for standalone books or games. Yes, they are that good. For Star Wars fans, I would go as far to say that they are must-plays. I can still remember the key choices I made in both of those playthroughs, and how I agonized over making the right decision. This is what RPGs are supposed to be about, making decisions and customizing your character. This was something that SWTOR was great at doing. What better format for a Star Wars game than an RPG? Hell, what better than an MMORPG? You get the massive feeling of being in a Star Wars universe with all of the different roles and goodies therein. Want to be a cocky pilot with a desire for credits? You can feel right at home in a Star Wars MMO. Sure, many Star Wars fans will be quick to say that SWTOR was not like SWG in any way, but it was still another chance to be that Star Wars character you always wanted to be. A chance to have your dreams as a flight pilot realized, or Dark Jedi realized in an MMO format. SWTOR might not have had the same level of immersion as does WG, or in sheer amount of options of character to create, but it still did a good job of guiding you with a very Star Wars feeling type of story. SWTOR is significant in the video game world because it was another chance at realizing a Star Wars game in an MMORPG format. Flawed or not, we have to at least remark about BioWare giving it a shot. It certainly wasn't a cheap endeavor, and they in many ways put the future of their very company on the line for such a game. We will remember SWTOR for these aforementioned reasons and likely more, but for some, they can't quite shake the bad taste in their mouth, asking the question as to why SWTOR didn't meet their expectations. What are some of the reasons SWTOR did not succeed to the standards set by BioWare and their fans? Fans of this series surely aren't foreign to the idea of overhype meaning sure doom for a title. With SWTOR, this is quite possibly one of the largest cases of such. When SWTOR was announced, EA BioWare kept all information about the game closely guarded. This meant over the course of years we got a slow trickle of data coming out. Needless to say, this created an insane amount of hype. SWTOR strategically didn't show much early on. They wanted to create more intrigue for the game, which was certainly effective. But when you have millions of people hyped for a launch of a game that in many ways could be a successor to the previous Star Wars Galaxies MMO, you create a feeding frenzy when people are actually able to play the game. This is where launch becomes so strenuous. You get people constantly taxing the servers and people who will play inordinate amounts of time and can reach the end game quite quickly. Once people reach the end game in SWTOR, they realize that the game, well, wasn't really what was advertised. To some extent, that's just the nature of hype. Hype rarely ever is accurately met. In many ways, hype is a fantasization of what people want something to be. So when they actually get a chance to play the game and it doesn't fit their fantasies, well, they are inevitably let down and likely the kinds to leave negative reviews on a game. We certainly have to judge a title based on at least partial initial expectations, which are generally created by previously mentioned hype. When you have BioWare devs saying that KOTOR fans have nothing to worry about and that SWTOR is going to be KOTOR 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, well, you can kind of understand why when people didn't think that that was the case, they got a little bit frustrated. There's a case to make that if SWTOR was properly marketed for what the game became in 2015 through 2017, maybe we wouldn't have judged the title so harshly. But that's something I'll talk about a little bit more later. It's a bit of an elephant in the room at this point, but I very much did a death of a game on SWG, and it's still very relevant to SWTOR and its failure. SWG captured the hearts of MMO fans quite unlike any other MMO, especially Star Wars fans. Here you had this universe where you could make your character be just about anything that you wanted them to be. A pirate who was a neutral faction eager to make some sort of money or credits. You could be a dedicated trader and never pick up a blaster. You could be a Jedi, you could be a Dark Jedi, and you could even be an entertainer who just sung, songs or danced in a cantina. The level of immersion in SWG didn't come from developer-created story, but instead, player-created story. This is typical in a sandbox. When SWTOR was announced, a good portion of people, me included, expected SWTOR would have some level of sandbox in it. It was supposed to be a Star Wars MMO. It didn't seem to make sense to have a heavily instanced Star Wars game because it sort of went against the nature of what the universe stood for. But that's what SWTOR was, a heavily instanced and linear MMO. Now, there isn't anything inherently wrong with this, except when you rely more on developer content versus player content, you put more of a strain on the development team, which in turn takes more time to develop content, thus creating the never-ending time sink by the developers. When you have a game that focuses on being a sandbox, a set of tools that players can use and create stories themselves is far easier to maintain such a thing. SWG's legacy affected SWTOR quite directly, because once SWG fans found out that SWTOR wasn't what they wanted or thought it was supposed to be, they were very quick to abandon the game. You have to realize, these fans, speaking of myself here as well, had played SWG and saw the game ripped away from them in many ways. They thought that SWTOR was going to be the better version of SWG. SWTOR directly contributed to the death of Star Wars Galaxies, after all, since when SWTOR was close to launching, Star Wars Galaxies was forced to be shut down. It made no sense for them to have competition for SWTOR, and thus SWG had to die. So when SWTOR doesn't live up to the previously mentioned expectations, especially from those aforementioned disenfranchised SWG players, it created more population losses. I can't tell you how many people I saw complain on the forums and even in my old guilds that SWTOR was nothing like SWG, and they weren't necessarily saying such in a positive way. It could be unfair to expect SWTOR to be SWG, it after all never claimed to be a spiritual successor or a sequel. But that's the thing with a popular series like Star Wars. People will inevitably look at the most prominent stories or games in the franchise and compare them to the other ones. This is why many of us SWG players couldn't take the space portion of SWTOR seriously. An on-the-rails shooter? Really? In 2011, an on-the-rails shooter? Even X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, which came out in 1997, had better space combat. How can you have a Star Wars MMO with the on-the-rails space combat experience? What's the point in giving us a starship if it was nothing more than a place to talk to our companions? No. Ex-Star Wars Galaxies fans couldn't sit well with such. Hell, Star Wars fans in general should have collectively cried a foul. You realize a good portion of starships aren't singly flown, right? The Millennium Falcon had a crew, remember? Nothing of sort in SWTOR. SWG really spoiled us in this aspect. I don't like to compare the two games, as I mentioned that they are very different games, but I find it hard to make a case when comparing the two that SWG just doesn't feel outright more like a Star Wars game. The Hero Engine. This isn't a particularly pretty topic to talk about, and in many cases feels like something I might spout as a red herring to you guys on occasion. But engines are important. They are the backbone of a game. The Hero engine is certainly a reason why SWTOR failed to meet its expectations. The combat is slow, it was extremely laggy up to months after launch, and games like Battlefield 3 were having better performance on ultra settings than SWTOR. Sure, performance issues at launch likely aren't foreign to MMO players, but the issues were compounded in SWTOR because BioWare arrogantly acted like it was only a minor issue. They even came out to try to infer that the majority of players that were having these issues, well, they weren't the majority. Meanwhile, there's a 110-page thread on SWTOR forums from the time of launch of people complaining about these issues. It's one thing to have issues and frustrate your consumers, it's another to have a said issue and then try and minimize the problem or ignore the concerns of the people. There was also the issue of the ability delay present at launch, where someone calculated there was a near 1 second delay before your ability fired, and no, it wasn't the global cooldown. The issue left for a number of years and quite randomly found itself back in the game in 2015. Obviously, the Hero engine has some sort of issue in regards to the way the abilities fire, otherwise this wouldn't be a recurring issue in the game. But the engine itself issues withstanding, I also just find to be quite poor when compared to its competitors. When you play a Star Wars game, it's important you feel the weight of your strikes and abilities, as well as feeling like you are powerful enough to have fast momentum and fast speed, right? This is why the Jedi Knight game series is so well respected. Same with Battlefront. They have quick and responsive gameplay. SWTOR, weirdly enough, is even slower than Star Wars Galaxy's combat. How are you supposed to feel epic when it feels like your character's moving through mud? I find it a hard case to make that BioWare was better using the Hero engine than some other engine. And it's not like only SWTOR has had issues with this engine. The Repopulation had a number of issues with the engine, even going as far to try and use another engine in its stead. I don't know how they found out about the Hero engine, BioWare in this case, and who decided it was the best engine for SWTOR to use, but that Hero engine rep must have been a hell of a salesman. Someone watching this might feel I have some sort of vendetta against SWTOR, or maybe even think it's a bad game. And let me set things straight. I think SWTOR is a good game. Yep, I said it. I actually think it's one of the better Star Wars games. The biggest issue with SWTOR is not that it's a bad game, it's that it was created and advertised to be something that it really just wasn't. SWTOR was announced as a massive multiplayer role-playing game. What we got, well, wasn't exactly massive. Sure, there's some sort of massive amount of story and massive amount of voiced characters, but does that really make SWTOR an MMO? Like, truly? Its planets and zones are fairly linear, with little to no activities to do on them. Space is on rails, and your spaceship is unable to be customized inside and thus serves like a hub for your companions, more so than some actual home or, type of player housing. The PvP, while in SWTOR, is mostly instance. Sure, there are PvP zones on certain planets, but with little to no reason to be at these zones, they are ghost lands. And Ilum? Ilum. Where is the MMO part of SWTOR? Raids and operations? Maybe. But is that enough to really be called an MMO? Destiny isn't called an MMO FPS, and it has plenty of raid content and such. Plenty of other similar types of games aren't called MMOs just because they have raids in them, or just because they have instance PvP. SWTOR frankly has an identity crisis. EA BioWare was well aware of this. That's why they spent the last 3 expansions in the last couple of years trying to focus on being more single-player content focused. Sure, they sprinkle in a few new raids and group content, but it's all icing on the cake. The actual cake is made of a single-player content. Hell, the whole Knights of the Fallen Empire expansions has chapters upon chapters of story content, in which you could theoretically never even see another player during. It's almost like it took SWTOR a few years to come to the realization that all that it thought it was supposed to be upon birth was, well, wrong. And that it should adapt to be truly what it should have been all along, which was a story-based game. I came back to SWTOR just last year, playing through all the recent story content, and I truly enjoyed my time. What it took for me to let go of that previous hatred or annoyance with SWTOR was let go of any preconceived notions of what the game was supposed to be. Instead, I took it for what I think it is, a multiplayer story-based game. I never grouped with a single person during my 100 hours returning to the game. Instead, I went through and beat nearly every class storyline, then proceeded to beat the expansion stories. When I stopped trying to treat SWTOR like an MMO, I was finally able to really enjoy the game. And that's a key reason why the game failed. If it was properly budgeted, advertised, and designed to be just that, a multiplayer story-based game, think of something along the likes of like Divinity Original Sin 2. Who knows? Maybe it wouldn't have bled so many players and not let as many people down as it did. Though I doubt that that game would have made EA as much money as SWTOR did during its half-a-decade runtime. So maybe in the end the decision was a good business decision. Creatively, could you imagine an SWTOR that didn't pretend to be an MMO, but instead focused on its story content? Now that's a true KOTOR 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, am I right? Fanboys and girls of SWTOR all collectively are up in arms ready to find my weakest point and pick it apart. SWTOR has been on the decline for a good amount of time and likely won't ever recover due to the reasons that I mentioned above regarding licensing and the overhead costs. Still, it will continue to hobble along, and SWTOR forumers will continue to white knight any attempts at discussing such, while doomsayers will continue to be caricatures of themselves. If there's one thing I hope you guys can take away from this video, it's that SWTOR quite obviously doesn't have much time to live. Not with its weak foundation and so-so expansion quality. I just hope another developer will be willing to take the risk on doing a third MMO in the Star Wars universe, because I don't want to live in a world where we don't get another Star Wars MMO realized. Star Wars Old Republic is not a bad game. It's a good game. It's just not a good game in the way that it was supposed to be. And maybe that's why in the end we consider it a failure. Thanks for watching, guys.